My name is Marianne Davies, and for 37 years, I dedicated my life to Central Freight in Richmond, Virginia. For nearly 4 decades, I was the backbone of the company's logistics operations, the invisible force that kept everything running smoothly. Until one day, I wasn't. I still remember my first day at Central Freight. It was 1987, and I was a bright-eyed 22-year-old with a fresh associate's degree in business administration. The company was smaller then, just a handful of trucks and a modest warehouse on the outskirts of Richmond. The owner, Harold Jenkins, took a chance on me despite my lack of experience. "You've got good eyes," he told me during the interview. "I can see you're detail-oriented. That's what we need here." Harold was right. I was meticulous, organized, and quick to learn. Within my first year, I had streamlined the scheduling system, reducing delivery delays by 15%. By year 3, I was coordinating with suppliers across 3 states. By year 5, I was handling all major logistics operations. Central Freight grew, and I grew with it. Over the decades, I built relationships with our suppliers that went beyond business. I knew about Tom from Eastern Distributing's daughter's college graduation. I sent flowers when Maria from Consolidated Shipping lost her husband. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and personal preferences. These weren't just business tactics. I genuinely cared about these people. We'd been through recessions, natural disasters, and industry upheavals together. They trusted me because they knew I would always do right by them. Harold retired 15 years ago, passing the company to his son, Michael. Michael respected the old guard, including me. He understood the value of institutional knowledge and experience. Under his leadership, Central Freight continued to thrive, expanding our operations to cover the entire eastern seaboard. I was promoted to logistics coordinator, a position created specifically for me. Then, 3 years ago, Michael decided to step back from day-to-day operations. He brought in Greg Walker, a 34-year-old MBA with slick presentations and buzzwords like disruptive innovation and vertical integration. Greg had worked at a larger transportation company in New York and had the credentials that impressed the board. Michael remained as president, but gave Greg considerable autonomy as the new chief operating officer. From day one, Greg made it clear that he saw the older employees as obstacles rather than assets. He brought in his friend Tina Reynolds as his executive assistant, a sharp-tongued woman with ambition that radiated from her like heat. Together, they began what they called a modernization initiative, which seemed primarily focused on pushing out anyone over 50. At first, the changes were subtle. My invitation to the weekly executive meetings stopped coming. Reports I'd been generating for decades were suddenly assigned to younger team members. My suggestions in larger meetings were met with patronizing smiles and comments like, "That's an interesting perspective, Marianne, but we're looking for more forward-thinking approaches." I adapted. I learned the new software systems they implemented, often faster than the younger employees. I updated my methods and embraced the changes that made sense. But it wasn't enough. Greg and Tina had decided I was a relic, and nothing I did would change their minds. The final months were a slow-motion car crash. Tina began documenting concerns about my performance, delayed shipments that weren't my fault, miscommunications that never happened, supplier complaints that didn't exist. I tried speaking with Michael, but Greg had his ear, painting me as resistant to change and technologically inept. Then came that fateful Monday morning. I arrived at my desk to find Greg waiting for me, a folder in his hand and HR representative standing awkwardly beside him. "Marianne, we need to talk," he said, gesturing toward a small conference room. I knew what was coming. I'd seen it happen to others. Walter from accounting, Patricia from customer service, James from fleet management. All long-timers, all pushed out to make way for younger, cheaper employees who wouldn't question Greg's vision. After careful consideration, Greg read mechanically from a prepared statement. "We've decided to eliminate your position as part of our ongoing restructuring efforts." The HR representative slid a severance package across the table, 2 months' pay for 37 years of service. "We'll need you to clean out your desk today," she added, not meeting my eyes. I didn't argue, I didn't plead. I simply nodded, signed the papers, and asked for a box for my belongings. Greg seemed almost disappointed by my lack of reaction. Perhaps he'd been hoping for tears or anger, something to confirm his narrative that I was emotionally unsuited for the modern workplace. As I packed up my desk, Tina hovered nearby, ostensibly helping but really making sure I didn't take anything I shouldn't. I could see the triumph in her eyes, poorly disguised as sympathy. "Change is hard," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "But sometimes it's necessary for growth." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and smiled. Not the smile of someone defeated, but the smile of someone who knows something you don't. "Yes," I agreed quietly. "Sometimes it is." I walked out of Central Freight that day with a small box of personal items and 37 years of institutional knowledge that couldn't be replaced with any software system or management theory. I also walked out with something else: the personal phone numbers and email addresses of our 49 major suppliers. Relationships I'd cultivated for decades. Connections built on trust and mutual respect. I didn't have a plan for revenge when I left. I simply went home, opened a bottle of wine, and allowed myself one evening of self-pity. The next morning, I woke up, made coffee, and started updating my resume, preparing for the daunting task of job hunting at 59. Then my phone rang. It was Darren from Southeast Transport, our largest supplier. "Marianne," he said, his voice concerned. "I just tried to reach you at the office, and they told me you no longer work there." "What happened?" I gave him the sanitized version: restructuring, position eliminated. Time for new opportunities. But Darren wasn't buying it. "That's bull," he said bluntly. "You've been the heart of that operation for decades. Who's handling our account now?" "I believe Tina will be taking over temporarily," I replied. There was a pause. Then Darren said something that changed everything. "Well, they just lost our business. I'm not dealing with anyone but you, Marianne. Wherever you go next, let me know. Southeast Transport goes with you." By the end of that day, I'd received similar calls from 6 other suppliers. By the end of the week, that number had grown to 15. I hadn't solicited any of this support. They had reached out to me. These weren't just business contacts. These were people who had become friends over decades of working together. 2 weeks after my dismissal, my phone rang again. This time, it was Michael Jenkins. His voice was strained. "Marianne, we need to talk. Can you come to the office tomorrow?" I agreed to meet him, curiosity getting the better of me. When I arrived at Central Freight the next day, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. The receptionist, a new hire who had replaced our longtime front desk manager just months before, looked surprised to see me. "Mr. Jenkins is expecting you," she said, directing me to his office. Michael wasn't alone. Greg sat across from him, his face pale and drawn. When I entered, Michael stood to greet me while Greg remained seated, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. "Marianne, thank you for coming," Michael said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "We have a situation that I'm hoping you can help us with." I sat down, smoothed my skirt, and waited. "In the past 2 weeks," Michael continued, "we've lost 23 supplier contracts. Another 15 are threatening to terminate by the end of the month. They're all asking for you." I kept my expression neutral, though inside I felt a flicker of satisfaction. "That's unfortunate," I said. Greg finally looked up, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "What did you say to them?" he demanded. "What kind of lies have you been spreading about Central Freight?" Michael shot him a warning glance. "Greg, please." He turned back to me. "Marianne, we're not accusing you of anything. We understand that these relationships were built over many years. What we're asking is if you would consider coming back, at least temporarily, to help smooth things over with our suppliers." I allowed myself a small smile. "Coming back in what capacity?" "As a consultant," Michael replied quickly, "with full autonomy over supplier relations, and, of course, a significant increase in compensation." I leaned back in my chair, considering the offer. Part of me wanted to refuse outright, to walk away and let them deal with the mess they'd created. But another part of me, the part that had devoted nearly 4 decades to building this company, couldn't just abandon ship. "I'll need to think about it," I said finally. "And I'll need to see the terms in writing." Michael nodded eagerly. "Of course, we can have something drafted by tomorrow." As I stood to leave, Greg finally spoke again, his voice strained. "I hope you understand that the decision to let you go wasn't personal. It was a business decision." I looked at him steadily. "In my experience, Greg, all business decisions are personal to someone. I'll be in touch. Michael." Over the next few days, I received calls from more suppliers, all with the same message: they wanted to work with me, not with Central Freight without me. I hadn't encouraged any of them to leave, but I hadn't discouraged them either. I simply listened and thanked them for their support. Michael sent over a consulting contract that was surprisingly generous, triple my former salary for a 6-month engagement. I could see the desperation in the terms. But as I considered the offer, I realized something important: I didn't want to go back. Not even temporarily. For 37 years, I had given Central Freight my loyalty, my expertise, and my dedication. In return, I had been discarded like an outdated piece of equipment. Going back, even on my terms, felt like accepting that treatment. Instead, I began exploring a different path. Several of the suppliers had suggested I start my own logistics consulting firm. With my experience and connections, they argued, I could provide valuable services to multiple companies rather than just one. The idea was beginning to take root. I called Michael and declined his offer. "I appreciate the opportunity," I told him, "but I've decided to move in a different direction." There was a long pause before he responded. "I understand, Marianne. For what it's worth, I should have stepped in sooner. I let Greg make decisions I shouldn't have allowed. This situation has made that very clear." "What will happen to Greg and Tina?" I asked, more curious than concerned. "The board is meeting next week," Michael said. "Given the financial impact of losing so many suppliers, I imagine there will be significant changes in our management structure." After hanging up, I made another call to Darren at Southeast Transport. "I'm starting my own consulting firm," I told him. "Would Southeast be interested in becoming my first client?" "Absolutely," he replied without hesitation. "When can you start?" By the end of the month, I had secured consulting contracts with 12 former Central Freight suppliers. My new company, MD Logistics Consulting, was officially in business. I rented a small office space, hired a part-time assistant, ironically, a bright young woman in her 20s, and began building something that was truly mine. 3 months later, I received an email from Patricia, my former colleague from customer service who had also been pushed out by Greg's modernization initiative. She was still in touch with people at Central Freight and had news to share: both Greg and Tina had been terminated. An internal audit had revealed not just the disaster with the suppliers, but also some creative accounting that had inflated their performance metrics. Michael had resumed day-to-day operations and was trying to rebuild the company's reputation. I felt no joy at their downfall, only a sense of justice. What goes around comes around, as they say. I wished them no ill will, but I couldn't help but hope they had learned something from the experience. Perhaps they now understood that experience and relationships matter in business, that people aren't just resources to be used and discarded. As for me, at 59, I had accidentally found the career independence I never knew I wanted. My consulting business was thriving, expanding beyond my initial client base to include companies throughout the Eastern Seaboard. I was working fewer hours but making more money. More importantly, I was valued for my knowledge and experience rather than dismissed because of my age. I sometimes think about that day when Greg and Tina thought they had won, when they believed they had successfully pushed me out to make way for their vision of a younger, more innovative company. They couldn't have imagined the consequences of their actions, the exodus of suppliers, the financial impact, the damage to their careers. They saw me as just another expendable older employee, a relic of the past. What they failed to understand was that in logistics, as in life, The connections you build and the trust you establish over years cannot be replaced overnight with new systems or younger faces. Sometimes, when I'm meeting with clients or mentoring younger professionals in the industry, I think about sending Greg and Tina a thank you note. After all, their short-sighted decision to fire me after 37 years led to the most rewarding phase of my career. But I don't need to. My success is thank you enough. In the end, Greg and Tina taught me an invaluable lesson: never tie your worth to a company that sees you as replaceable. Build your skills, nurture your relationships. And remember that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's moving forward and thriving in ways your detractors never thought possible. 1 year after my dismissal from Central Freight, I received an invitation to speak at a regional logistics conference. The topic: building and maintaining supplier relationships in the digital age. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the audience of industry professionals, I spotted a familiar face in the back row. Greg Walker. He looked different, older, somehow, though only a year had passed. When our eyes met, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I nodded back and continued with my presentation. Afterward, as attendees gathered around to ask questions and exchange business cards, Greg approached. "Congratulations on your success," he said, extending his hand. "Your presentation was insightful." I shook his hand, noting the absence of his previous arrogance. "Thank you, Greg. Are you still in the industry?" He gave a rueful smile. "In a manner of speaking, I'm working for a smaller operation in North Carolina. Starting over, you could say." "Starting over can be a good thing," I replied. "It offers perspective." "Yes," he agreed, looking thoughtful. "Perspective is exactly what I've gained." He hesitated, then added, "I owe you an apology. Marianne, what happened at Central Freight? I made assumptions based on age rather than ability. It was wrong, and the company paid a heavy price for my mistake." I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Apology accepted," I said finally. "We all make mistakes. Greg, the important thing is learning from them." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. "I have certainly learned from mine. Your consulting firm is doing well, I hear." "It is," I confirmed. "As it turns out, there's quite a demand for experience and established relationships in our industry." "Who knew?" I added with a small smile. Greg had the grace to look embarrassed. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I'm trying to rebuild my career, and I could use some advice from someone who understands the industry as well as you do. Would you consider having coffee sometime? Strictly professional, of course." I considered his request. The old wound had healed, leaving behind not bitterness, but wisdom. "I think that could be arranged," I said. "Here's my card. Have your assistant call mine to set it up." As Greg walked away, I felt a sense of closure. The chapter of my life at Central Freight was truly over, but the story of my career was still being written, and it was turning out to be more interesting than I ever could have imagined. The consulting business continued to grow beyond my expectations. By the 18-month mark, I had hired 3 full-time employees and was considering opening a second office in Charlotte. My client list had expanded to include not just suppliers, but also transportation companies seeking to improve their logistics operations. One day, as I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office, my assistant, Jessica, buzzed me on the intercom. "Ms. Davies, there's a Tina Reynolds here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." I felt a momentary surge of surprise. Tina had been the last person I'd expected to walk through my door. "Send her in, Jessica," I said after a brief hesitation. Tina entered my office with noticeably less confidence than she'd shown during our last encounter at Central Freight. Gone were the designer clothes and the imperious attitude. Instead, she looked ordinary. Professionally dressed, but not flashy. Her expression cautious rather than calculating. "Thank you for seeing me, Marianne," she said, remaining standing until I gestured for her to take a seat. "What can I do for you, Tina?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. I've been job hunting for 8 months, she said. After Central Freight, I found a position with another company, but it didn't work out. The truth is, she continued, looking down at her hands, I've developed a reputation in the industry. People know about what happened at Central Freight. I said nothing, waiting for her to continue. I saw your presentation at the logistics conference last month. She went on. You were brilliant. The way you talked about building relationships based on mutual respect and trust, it made me realize how much I got wrong. And now, I prompted when she fell silent. And now I'm here to ask for your help, she said, meeting my gaze directly for the first time. Not for a job, I know that's not reasonable given our history, but maybe for advice, or a reference if you feel you can give one. I'm trying to rebuild, Marianne, and I don't know where else to turn. I studied her, looking for signs of the manipulative woman who had helped engineer my dismissal. What I saw instead was someone humbled by failure. Someone who had learned the hard way that careers built on undermining others stand on shaky foundations. Why should I help you, Tina? I asked, not unkindly but directly. You were quite happy to see me pushed out of Central Freight? She nodded, accepting the challenge in my question. I was wrong, she said simply. I was ambitious and short-sighted. I thought success meant climbing over others to get to the top. I've had a lot of time to reflect since then, and I understand now how destructive that mindset was, to others and ultimately to myself. Her candor surprised me. I had expected excuses or deflection, not this straightforward acknowledgement of her mistakes. What kind of position are you looking for? I asked. Relief flickered across her face. Anything in operations or project management. I'm willing to start at a lower level than before and work my way up the right way this time. I considered her request. The easy response would be to turn her away, to let her experience the full consequences of her actions. But there was something genuine in her humility, a real desire to change and grow. I can't offer you a position with my company, I said finally. The history between us would make that complicated. But I do know of an opening with one of my clients. They're looking for a project coordinator. It would be a step down from your previous role, but it's a solid company with room for advancement based on merit. Hope dawned in her eyes. That would be more than generous, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, I cautioned. I'll give them your resume and a qualified recommendation, meaning I'll be honest about both your skills and the reasons you're looking for a new position. What happens after that will be up to you and how you present yourself in the interview. Tina nodded. That's fair, more than fair, actually. As she stood to leave, she paused. Can I ask you something? Why are you willing to help me at all, after what I did? I smiled slightly. Because holding on to resentment takes too much energy, Tina. And because everyone deserves a second chance if they're genuinely willing to learn from their mistakes. After she left, I reflected on our conversation. There was a time when I might have taken satisfaction in seeing her struggle, in knowing that karma had caught up with her as it had with Greg. But that satisfaction would have been hollow. The true victory wasn't in their downfall, but in my resilience, in my ability to rebuild and thrive despite their efforts to sideline me. 2 weeks later, Tina emailed to let me know she'd gotten the job with my client. Her note was brief, but sincere, promising to make the most of the opportunity and thanking me for my willingness to look beyond the past. I found myself rooting for her success, not because I had forgotten or fully forgiven what happened at Central Freight, but because I understood something fundamental about business and life. We all make mistakes, and we all deserve the chance to grow from them. Meanwhile, my consulting work had brought me into contact with Michael Jenkins again. Central Freight was struggling to recover from the supplier exodus, and Michael had swallowed his pride to hire my firm to help rebuild those relationships. During one of our meetings, he confided that the company might not survive. We've lost too much ground to competitors, he admitted. The damage Greg and Tina did was more extensive than we initially realized. It wasn't just Greg and Tina, I pointed out gently. They were symptoms of a larger problem. The company lost sight of what made it successful in the first place. Relationships built on trust and mutual benefit, Michael nodded, looking every bit his 65 years. You're right, of course, and I bear much of the responsibility for that. I stepped back too far, trusted the wrong people with my father's legacy. I felt a pang of sympathy for him. Despite everything that had happened, I still cared about Central Freight and the people who worked there. It's not too late to turn things around, I said. But it will take time and a fundamental shift in how the company operates. Would you consider coming back? He asked suddenly. Not as a consultant, but as our chief operations officer. Full autonomy, equity stake, board position, whatever it takes. We need you, Marianne. The offer was tempting, I had to admit. There was a certain poetic justice in returning to Central Freight in a position far above the one I'd been dismissed from. But I had built something of my own now, something that gave me not just financial security, but also personal satisfaction and freedom. I'm flattered, Michael. But my answer is still no, I said. My consulting firm is where I belong now. But I will help you find the right person for the role, someone who understands the importance of experience and relationships. He accepted my decision with grace. And over the following months, I helped Central Freight begin the long process of rebuilding. It wasn't easy. And there were times when I questioned whether the company could be saved. But slowly, with new leadership and a renewed focus on the values that had made it successful in the first place, Central Freight began to stabilize. 2 years after my dismissal, I was invited to Central Freight's 40th anniversary celebration. As I walked through the doors of the company where I had spent most of my adult life, I was greeted with warm smiles and genuine appreciation from longtime employees and new hires alike. Michael made a point of acknowledging me in his speech, crediting my consulting work with helping to save the company. Sometimes, he said, we don't appreciate what we have until it's gone. Marianne Davies was the heart and soul of Central Freight for 37 years. And we made the grave mistake of letting her go. While we couldn't convince her to come back permanently, her willingness to help us rebuild taught us an invaluable lesson about the true meaning of loyalty and professionalism. As applause filled the room, I felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in what I had helped create, satisfaction in knowing my worth had finally been recognized, and a sense of peace with the path my career had taken. After the ceremony, I mingled with former colleagues and new employees, sharing stories and offering advice. Several younger staff members sought me out, eager to learn from my experience. It struck me that my forced departure had ultimately created opportunities not just for me, but for others as well. Opportunities to learn, to grow, and to understand the true value of experience in a world often too eager to discard it in favor of youth and novelty. As I was preparing to leave, Michael approached me one last time. I still wish you'd come back, he said with a rueful smile. But I have to admit, you seem happier now than I've ever seen you. I am, I confirmed. It turns out that being pushed out of my comfort zone was exactly what I needed, even if the way it happened was less than ideal. Any advice for me as we move forward? He asked. I considered for a moment. Remember that companies aren't just balance sheets and assets, I said finally. They're collections of people with skills, knowledge, and relationships. The moment you start seeing employees as expendable is the moment you begin to undermine your own foundation. Michael nodded thoughtfully. Lesson learned, he said, though at considerable cost. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey of the past 2 years. From the shock and humiliation of being dismissed after 37 years of service to the unexpected triumph of building my own successful business, it had been a period of profound transformation. Greg and Tina had meant to discard me, to push me aside in favor of their vision of a younger, more innovative company. Instead, they had inadvertently launched me into the most fulfilling chapter of my professional life. They had seen my age as a liability, never recognizing that the very experience they devalued was my greatest asset. In the months that followed the anniversary celebration, my consulting business continued to thrive. I expanded into new areas, including training and mentorship programs specifically designed to help companies bridge the gap between generations in the workplace. Drawing on my own experience, I helped organizations recognize and value the contributions of older employees while also integrating the fresh perspectives of younger workers. One day, about 3 years after my dismissal from Central Freight, I received a call from a business reporter for a major industry publication. "Ms. Davies," she began. "I'm writing a feature on age discrimination in the transportation and logistics sector. Your name keeps coming up as someone who not only experienced it, but turned it into an opportunity. Would you be willing to share your story?" I agreed to the interview, seeing it as a chance to address an issue that affected many workers in my generation. When the article was published, titled, "The Experience Advantage How Age Discrimination Backfired at Central Freight," it sent ripples through the industry. My phone began ringing with calls from other older professionals who had faced similar situations, seeking advice on how to navigate their own transitions. This unexpected attention led to speaking engagements, then to a book deal. Valued, Not Expired: Leveraging Experience in a Youth-Obsessed Workplace became a surprise bestseller in the business category, further expanding my platform and influence. At 62, I found myself busier and more fulfilled than I had been at any point in my 4-decade career. My consulting firm had grown to 15 employees, with offices in Richmond, Charlotte, and Atlanta. I had become an advocate for experienced professionals, helping them recognize and articulate their value in a job market that often overlooked them. Occasionally, I would run into former Central Freight colleagues who would update me on the company's progress. It had survived, though in a smaller, more focused form. Michael had eventually stepped down, passing leadership to a team that included both experienced industry veterans and younger innovators. A balanced approach that honored the company's history while embracing necessary change. Greg, I heard, had gradually rebuilt his career, though never regaining the level of authority he had wielded at Central Freight. Our occasional coffee meetings had evolved into a cautious professional respect. He had learned his lesson the hard way, but he had learned it thoroughly, becoming an advocate for intergenerational collaboration in his new organization. Tina had flourished in her second chance, working her way up to a management position with my client company. She had developed a reputation for mentoring younger employees while respecting the contributions of older ones, a complete reversal of her previous approach. When we occasionally crossed paths at industry events, there was a genuine warmth in our interactions that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. As for Central Freight, it had become a case study in both what to avoid and how to recover from a crisis of leadership. The company now explicitly valued institutional knowledge and experience, integrating them with innovation rather than seeing them as opposing forces. 5 years after being fired, I received a Special Industry Achievement Award for my contributions to logistics and transportation over 4 decades. As I stood at the podium accepting the honor, I looked out at the audience, a mix of longtime colleagues, clients, competitors, and younger professionals I had mentored. When I was dismissed from my position after 37 years, I told them, I thought it was the end of my career. I was 59 years old in an industry increasingly fixated on youth and disruption. What I didn't realize then was that it wasn't an ending at all, but a beginning. I paused, looking at the faces watching me intently. There's a common misconception in business that experience is a liability in times of rapid change. The truth is exactly the opposite. Experience is what allows us to navigate change effectively, to distinguish between valuable innovations and fleeting trends, to understand that relationships and trust are the foundations of lasting success. I saw heads nodding in agreement, particularly among the older attendees who had faced their own battles against age discrimination. My story isn't unique, I continued. Many of you have faced similar challenges. The lesson I hope you take from my experience is this: your value doesn't diminish with age. If anything, it increases. The key is to recognize that value yourself, even when others fail to see it. As applause filled the room, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. Being fired after 37 years had seemed like the worst thing that could happen to me professionally. Instead, it had been the catalyst for the most rewarding phase of my career. Greg and Tina had intended to push me aside, viewing me as an outdated component in their modernization plan, What they couldn't have foreseen was that in doing so, they would set in motion a chain of events that would not only demonstrate my true value, but also create a platform for me to help others in similar situations. As I left the stage, a young woman approached me, barely in her 20s, bright-eyed and eager, much as I had been when I started at Central Freight all those years ago. "Ms. Davies," she said, extending her hand. "Your speech was inspiring. I'm just starting in logistics, and I wondered if you might have any advice for someone at the beginning of their career." I smiled, taking her hand. "Value experience, both your own as you gain it and that of others around you. Build relationships based on respect and trust. And remember that in this industry, as in life, the connections you forge with people will always be your greatest asset." She nodded earnestly, clearly taking my words to heart. As we continued chatting, I saw in her the future of the industry, hopefully a future that would value contributions from professionals of all ages, recognizing that innovation and experience are not opposing forces but complementary strengths. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the event, I spotted Michael Jenkins across the room. He was retired now, his hair fully gray, but he still carried himself with the dignity of someone who had built something significant. He caught my eye and made his way over to me. "Congratulations on the award, Marianne," he said warmly. "Well deserved." "Thank you, Michael," I replied. "How are you enjoying retirement?" He smiled. "It has its moments. Though I've been doing some consulting work myself lately, seems I learned something from your example." "Full circle," I observed with a smile. "Indeed." He hesitated, then added, "You know, firing you was the biggest mistake of my professional life. But watching what you've built since then, it's been remarkable. Sometimes I think it all worked out exactly as it was supposed to." I considered his words. "Perhaps it did," I agreed, "though I wouldn't recommend that particular management strategy to others." He laughed, a genuine laugh that erased years from his face. "No, definitely not. But I am glad to see you thriving. Marianne, you've changed the conversation in our industry for the better." As we parted ways, I thought about his comment. Had everything worked out as it was supposed to? The path hadn't been easy or straightforward. Being fired after 37 years of loyal service had been painful and humiliating. The uncertainty of starting over at 59 had been frightening. Yet looking back from the vantage point of 5 years later, I could see that those challenges had led to opportunities I never would have pursued otherwise. My consulting firm was thriving. My book had helped countless older professionals navigate similar transitions. I'd found a voice and a platform to advocate for the value of experience in the workplace. In firing me, Greg and Tina had intended to remove an obstacle to their vision of a younger, more innovative company. Instead, they had inadvertently launched me into a new phase of my career that was more impactful and fulfilling than anything I could have imagined. The suppliers who had followed me, refusing to work with Central Freight after my dismissal, had not only helped me establish my consulting business, but had also sent a powerful message throughout the industry about the importance of relationships and trust. The chaos and panic that had ensued when 49 major suppliers threatened to leave had demonstrated in the most tangible way possible that experience and connections are not just nice-to-have assets, but essential components of business success. Now, at 64, I had options that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier. I could continue growing my consulting firm, gradually transitioning to a less hands-on role. I could focus on writing and speaking, sharing the lessons of my experience with a wider audience. I could even retire if I wanted to, secure in the knowledge that I had built something valuable and meaningful. The irony wasn't lost on me. Being pushed out of Central Freight had ultimately given me more freedom and fulfillment than I likely would have found if I had remained there until a traditional retirement. The very event that had seemed like a disaster had become the catalyst for the most rewarding chapter of my professional life. As I drove home from the award ceremony, I thought about the young woman who had approached me for advice. I hoped that when she reached my age, she would find herself in an industry that valued experience rather than discarded it, that recognized the unique contributions of professionals at all stages of their careers. More than that, I hoped she would never face the humiliation of being pushed aside after decades of loyal service. But if she did, I hoped she would remember my story, not as a cautionary tale of age discrimination, but as a testament to resilience and the unexpected opportunities that can arise from adversity. Being fired after 37 years had seemed like the end. Instead, it had been a beginning, the start of a journey that had taken me places I never could have anticipated. Greg and Tina had meant to sideline me, but in doing so, they had inadvertently set me free. 6 years after my dismissal from Central Freight, I received a call from an old colleague who still worked there. "Marianne," he said, his voice urgent. "Have you heard the news Central Freight is being acquired by Northeast Logistics?" The announcement sent ripples through the industry. Northeast Logistics was one of the largest transportation companies on the East Coast, known for its aggressive expansion strategy. The acquisition of Central Freight marked their entry into the specialized freight market that had been Central's niche for decades. Within weeks, I began receiving calls from former Central Freight employees concerned about their futures. Many feared that the acquisition would lead to massive layoffs as Northeast sought to eliminate redundancies and cut costs. Then came a call I hadn't expected, from the CEO of Northeast Logistics himself, Robert Chen. "Ms. Davies," he began, "I've been an admirer of your work for some time. Your book on leveraging experience in the workplace has influenced our approach at Northeast. I'm wondering if you would consider consulting with us on the Central Freight integration." The request caught me off guard. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Chen, but I should disclose that my history with Central Freight is complicated." "I'm well aware of that history," he replied. "In fact, it's part of why I'm calling. You understand Central Freight's culture and operations better than anyone. More importantly, you understand the value of its people, something we don't want to lose in the acquisition." Intrigued, I agreed to meet with him. When we sat down in Northeast's sleek corporate headquarters in Philadelphia, Chen explained his vision not to dismantle Central Freight, but to preserve its strengths while providing resources for growth. "We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past," he said, sliding a folder across the table, "including this." Inside was a comprehensive integration plan that specifically highlighted the retention of experienced employees as a priority. Chen had clearly done his homework, both on Central Freight's history and on my own advocacy for valuing experience in the workplace. "What exactly would my role be?" I asked. "Twofold," he replied. "First, to help us identify the key relationships and institutional knowledge that need to be preserved. Second, to work with our HR and operations teams to create a culture that values experience across the organization. We want to make this acquisition a model for how to integrate companies without losing what makes them valuable in the first place." The proposal was compelling, and I found myself drawn to the idea of helping shape Central Freight's future in a positive way. "I'll need to think about it," I said. "And I'd want complete transparency about your plans for the workforce." Chen agreed readily, providing additional documentation about Northeast's approach to acquisitions. After careful consideration and discussions with my team, I accepted the consulting role. The integration process was challenging but rewarding. Working closely with leadership teams from both companies, I helped identify the core strengths of Central Freight, particularly its long-standing supplier relationships and specialized knowledge of certain freight categories. More importantly, I advocated for the retention of experienced employees who embodied those strengths. To my surprise and satisfaction, Northeast followed through on its commitment to valuing experience. Rather than implementing the widespread layoffs many had feared, they created a structure that paired experienced Central Freight employees with Northeast team members to facilitate knowledge transfer and relationship continuity. One day, about 2 months into the integration process, Chen invited me to join him for a tour of Central Freight's main facility, the same building I'd walked out of 6 years earlier with a small box of personal belongings. As we moved through the warehouse and offices, I was greeted warmly by former colleagues, many of whom had been with the company almost as long as I had. "They respect you," Chen observed as we continued our tour. "Not just because of your success since leaving, but because you've come back to help ensure their future." "This place was my home for 37 years," I replied. The people here were my family. I couldn't just stand by and watch if there was a chance to help. As we completed the tour, Chen turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You know, when I read about what happened to you, being pushed out after 37 years because of your age, my first reaction was anger. Not just at the injustice of it, but at the sheer business stupidity. Business stupidity. I echoed, curious about his perspective. Absolutely, he said emphatically. In my experience, the most valuable asset any company has is its people, particularly those who carry its history and relationships. Discarding that asset for the sake of appearing more innovative or saving on salary costs is just bad business. It's short-term thinking that inevitably leads to long-term problems. His words resonated with me. What had happened at Central Freight under Greg and Tina's influence hadn't just been personally painful. It had been fundamentally unsound from a business perspective, as the subsequent supplier exodus had proven. The irony, I noted, is that Greg and Tina thought they were making Central Freight more competitive by pushing out older employees. Instead, they nearly destroyed the company. Chen nodded. And now we're investing millions to preserve exactly what they tried to eliminate: experience and relationships? He smiled. There's a lesson there for the entire industry. Indeed, there was. And it was a lesson I'd been advocating for since starting my consulting firm. The value of experience couldn't be measured solely in terms of technical skills or adaptability to new systems. It encompassed relationships built over decades, institutional knowledge that couldn't be documented in any manual, and the wisdom that came from navigating countless industry changes and challenges. As the integration progressed, I found myself drawn more deeply into the process than I had initially anticipated. What had begun as a limited consulting engagement evolved into a comprehensive role overseeing the preservation of Central Freight's culture and core competencies within the larger Northeast organization. About 6 months into the integration, Chen approached me with yet another unexpected proposal. We're creating a new position, he explained, Chief Culture and Legacy Officer for the combined organization. The role would focus on ensuring that we preserve the best elements of both companies' cultures while building something stronger together. I'd like you to consider taking it on. The offer gave me pause. At 65, I had built a successful consulting business that gave me both financial security and the freedom to choose my projects. Taking on a corporate executive role, even one as intriguing as this, would mean significant changes to my lifestyle and professional focus. I'm flattered, I told Chen, but I need to consider what this would mean for my consulting firm and the clients who depend on me. Of course, he replied. Take all the time you need. The position would be shaped around your expertise and preferences, including flexibility in hours and responsibilities. We value what you bring to the table, Marianne, and we're willing to structure the role in a way that works for you. Over the following weeks, I discussed the opportunity with trusted colleagues, clients, and family members. My consulting firm had grown to the point where day-to-day operations were managed by a capable team of partners, many of whom I had mentored over the years. They encouraged me to consider Chen's offer, seeing it as a natural evolution of my advocacy work. Think about it. My business partner, Elena, pointed out. You've been working to change how companies value experience for 6 years. This is a chance to implement those principles from the inside of one of the largest transportation companies on the East Coast. The impact could be enormous. Elena was right. As much as I had accomplished through my consulting work, books, and speaking engagements, the opportunity to directly shape the culture of a major corporation, particularly one that had just acquired my former company, offered the potential for more far-reaching influence. After careful consideration, I accepted the position with specific conditions. I would maintain partial ownership of my consulting firm. I would have direct reporting access to the CEO and board, and the role would include mentorship programs to support both experienced employees and younger staff members. Chen readily agreed to my terms, and at 65, an age when many of my peers were settling into retirement, I embarked on yet another new chapter in my career. My first day in the new role brought me back to Central Freight's headquarters, now adorned with both the Central and Northeast logos. As I walked through the familiar hallways, now bustling with a mix of longtime Central employees and Northeast team members, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 years earlier, I'd been escorted from this building, dismissed after 37 years of service because Greg and Tina had seen my age as a liability rather than an asset. Now I was returning as an executive of the company that had acquired Central Freight, specifically tasked with preserving and honoring the experience that Greg and Tina had devalued. The irony wasn't lost on me, nor on the many Central Freight veterans who greeted me with knowing smiles and warm handshakes. What had begun as a painful dismissal had led, through an unpredictable series of events, to an opportunity to transform how an entire organization viewed and valued experience. In my new role, I implemented programs that paired experienced employees with newer hires for mutual mentorship, the veterans sharing their industry knowledge and relationship skills, while the younger staff offered fresh perspectives on technology and emerging trends. I established recognition systems that rewarded long-term contributions alongside innovation. I worked with HR to create career paths that valued growth in all directions, not just upward mobility. Most importantly, I fostered a culture that recognized experience as a competitive advantage rather than a cost center. The results spoke for themselves within a year of the acquisition. Employee retention rates had improved dramatically. Supplier relationships had strengthened, and the combined company was outperforming its pre-merger projections. Chen was delighted with the outcomes. "What you've helped us build here," he told me during a quarterly review, "is becoming a model for the industry. We're getting inquiries from other companies wanting to know how we've managed such a successful integration." This external interest led to a new initiative, an industry consortium focused on age diversity and inclusion. With Northeast Logistics as the founding member and me as the chairperson, the consortium brought together companies across the transportation and logistics sector to share best practices for leveraging experience while fostering innovation. Through these efforts, the lessons of my journey, from being fired after 37 years to helping reshape industry attitudes toward experienced professionals, extended far beyond my own story or even Central Freight's. They became part of a larger conversation about the value of intergenerational collaboration in a rapidly changing business landscape. As I approached my 7th decade, I found myself in a position I never could have imagined when I was escorted from Central Freight with a small box of belongings. I was influencing how an entire industry thought about experience and age in the workplace. The very dismissal that had seemed so devastating had set in motion a chain of events that led to greater impact than I likely would have achieved had I remained in my original role until retirement. Greg and Tina, wherever they were now, had inadvertently launched me into the most meaningful and influential phase of my career. In trying to push me aside, they had instead pushed me forward into new challenges, new opportunities, and a new understanding of my own value. The suppliers who had followed me, refusing to work with Central Freight after my dismissal, had not only helped me establish my consulting business, but had also sent a powerful message throughout the industry: relationships matter, experience matters, loyalty matters. The panic their exodus had caused, reaching all the way to the president of the company, had been a vivid demonstration of the true value of what Greg and Tina had so casually discarded. Now, as Chief Culture and Legacy Officer for Northeast Logistics, I was in a position to ensure that such mistakes wouldn't be repeated, not just within our organization, but potentially across the industry. The wheel had come full circle, transforming a personal setback into a platform for positive change. One day, about 2 years into my tenure at Northeast, I received an unexpected email. The subject line read simply, "Long overdue apology." The sender was Tina Reynolds. "Dear Marianne," she wrote, "I've started and deleted this email a dozen times, never quite finding the right words. But after seeing the impact you're having at Northeast and across the industry, I can't put it off any longer. I need to properly apologize for my role in what happened at Central Freight. What Greg and I did was more than just a business mistake. It was cruel and short-sighted on a human level. We valued the appearance of innovation over actual performance. We saw age as a liability rather than the asset it truly is. And we treated you, someone who had given 37 years of loyal service, as disposable. The irony is that in trying to push you out, we ended up demonstrating your true value more powerfully than anything else could have. When those 49 suppliers followed you, it wasn't just about business relationships. It was a testament to the trust and respect you had earned over decades. I won't ask for forgiveness. What we did doesn't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that you've changed how I think about leadership and value in the workplace. The company I work for now has implemented many of the principles you advocate, and I've become something of an evangelist for age diversity within our organization. Thank you for the second chance you gave me years ago. It quite literally changed the course of my career and my understanding of what truly matters in business. With deep respect and admiration, Tina. The email moved me more than I had expected. There was a time when such an apology would have meant everything to me. Validation that the injustice I had experienced was real and recognized. Now, it felt like the closing of a circle, the final resolution of a chapter that had ultimately led to unexpected growth and opportunity. I replied with a simple message of appreciation for her honesty and an invitation to speak at an upcoming industry event focused on intergenerational collaboration in the workplace. Tina accepted eagerly, and her candid account of the mistakes made at Central Freight became one of the most powerful sessions of the conference. As my 7th decade approached, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the journey that had brought me to this point. Being fired after 37 years had seemed like the cruelest possible end to a loyal career. Instead, it had been the beginning of something far more significant than I could have imagined. The young schedulers who had cheered my departure, thinking they had eliminated an obstacle to their ambitions, had instead set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just my career, but potentially an industry's approach to valuing experience. The suppliers who left in my wake had caused panic not just for a president, but for an entire company, demonstrating in the most tangible way possible that relationships built over decades cannot be easily replaced. And I, at an age when many are winding down their professional lives, found myself energized by new challenges and opportunities to make a difference. My dismissal hadn't been the end of my story, but rather the catalyst for its most meaningful chapter. In the end, Greg and Tina had been right about one thing: change was necessary for growth. What they hadn't understood was that growth doesn't come from discarding experience, but from building upon it. From combining the wisdom of years with the energy of youth. From recognizing that true innovation emerges from collaboration across generations. That understanding, hard-won through my own experience of being valued, devalued, and ultimately revalued in ways I never could have anticipated, had become my legacy. My contribution to an industry and perhaps to the broader conversation about age and work in our society. As I left my office one evening, pausing to look back at the building that housed both painful memories and new beginnings, I smiled to myself. Life rarely follows the paths we expect, and sometimes its most difficult detours lead us to destinations more rewarding than any we could have planned. Being fired after 37 years had seemed like the end. Instead, it had been a beginning, the start of a journey that had taken me places I never could have anticipated. Greg and Tina had meant to sideline me, but in doing so, they had inadvertently set me free. The suppliers who followed me had caused panic in the president's office, but they had also helped me build something new and meaningful. And I, at 59, had found not the end of my career, but its most fulfilling chapter. The wheel turns, I thought as I walked to my car. Sometimes it crushes us beneath its weight, and sometimes it carries us forward to unexpected heights. The key is to keep moving, to remain open to the possibilities that emerge from even our most painful experiences. And with that thought, I drove home, already planning the next phase of a journey that had begun with an ending but had yet to reach its conclusion. 7 years after being fired from Central Freight, I found myself in a position I never could have imagined, addressing the annual conference of the National Transportation and Logistics Association as keynote speaker. The topic: Experience as Innovation Rethinking Age in the Workplace. Looking out at the audience of industry leaders, a mix of gray-haired veterans and young professionals, I shared the story that had become somewhat legendary in our field: how being fired after 37 years had led to a supplier exodus, a company in crisis, and ultimately a transformation in how an entire industry viewed the value of experience. The greatest irony, I told them, is that Greg and Tina thought they were innovating by pushing out older employees to make way for younger ones. What they failed to understand is that true innovation doesn't come from replacing one generation with another. It comes from bringing them together. From combining the fresh perspectives of youth with the hard-won wisdom of experience. The response was enthusiastic, with many attendees approaching me afterward to share their own stories of age-related challenges in the workplace. Some were older professionals who had faced discrimination similar to what I had experienced. Others were younger managers seeking guidance on how to better leverage the experience within their organizations. One conversation particularly stood out. A young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, waited patiently until most of the crowd had dispersed. "Ms. Davies," she began, "your speech was incredible, but I have a confession to make. I used to be one of those young managers who saw older employees as obstacles rather than assets." "What changed your perspective?" I asked, genuinely curious. "We lost our most experienced logistics coordinator," she replied. "Someone who'd been with the company for 20 years. We thought we could easily replace her with new systems and younger staff. 6 months and numerous client complaints later, we realized how wrong we were. The relationships she had built, the problems she could solve with a single phone call because she knew who to talk to, none of that could be replaced with technology or enthusiasm." Her story was a familiar one, a variation of what had happened at Central Freight, playing out across the industry in companies large and small. It reinforced what had become the core message of my work experience: is not a liability, but an asset. Not something to be discarded, but something to be valued and leveraged alongside new ideas and approaches. As my 7th decade progressed, I gradually began to step back from daily operations at Northeast Logistics, transitioning to a role as special advisor while maintaining my position as chairperson of the Industry Consortium on Age Diversity. This arrangement gave me more time to write, speak, and consult on the issues that had become my passion. My second book, The Experience Advantage: How Age Diversity Drives Innovation, became required reading in many business schools and corporate training programs. I found myself increasingly in demand as a speaker and advisor, not just in transportation and logistics, but across industries facing similar challenges with intergenerational workforces. 8 years after my dismissal from Central Freight, I received a call from a producer at a major business news network. "We're doing a special series on age in the workplace," she explained, "and your name came up repeatedly as someone who has not only experienced age discrimination, but has helped transform how companies think about it. Would you be willing to share your story on our program?" The opportunity to reach a broader audience with my message was compelling. I agreed to the interview, which would include a return to the Central Freight Building, now a Northeast Logistics facility, where my journey had begun and then so abruptly changed course. Walking through those doors with a camera crew in tow was a surreal experience. Many of the faces had changed, but the essence of the place remained familiar. As we toured the facility, I pointed out the desk where I had sat for so many years, the conference room where I had been dismissed, the areas where I had built relationships with colleagues and suppliers that would ultimately prove more durable than the management decisions that had pushed me out. "How does it feel?" the interviewer asked. "To come back here, knowing what happened and everything that has followed?" I considered the question carefully. "There was a time when returning here would have been painful," I admitted. "But now I see this place as just one chapter in a much larger story." Being fired after 37 years seemed like the end of something important. Instead, it was the beginning of something even more significant. "Do you harbor any resentment toward the people who dismissed you?" she pressed. "Not anymore," I replied honestly. Greg and Tina made a mistake, a significant one that nearly destroyed this company, but they also inadvertently set me on a path that has been more fulfilling and impactful than I likely would have found if I had remained here until retirement. In a strange way, I'm grateful for the push that forced me to discover capabilities I might never have explored otherwise. The interview aired as part of a week-long series on age and work in America. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of emails and messages from viewers who had experienced similar situations or who were inspired to rethink their own assumptions about age in the workplace. One message particularly caught my attention. It was from a man named David Jenkins, Harold Jenkins's grandson and Michael's son. He had recently taken over as president of a transportation company in the Midwest and had seen my interview. "Ms. Davies," he wrote, "though we've never met, your story has been part of our family's business discussions for years. My father often spoke of the mistake he made in allowing you to be pushed out of Central Freight. Your interview inspired me to take a hard look at our own organization and the assumptions we make about age and experience. As a result, we're implementing new policies to better support and leverage the knowledge of our most experienced employees. Thank you for turning what must have been a painful experience into a lesson that continues to benefit others." His message was a powerful reminder that the ripples from my experience continued to spread in ways I couldn't always see or anticipate. What had happened to me, being fired after 37 years of loyal service, wasn't unique. Similar scenarios played out in companies across the country every day. But the response, the supplier exodus that caused panic in the president's office, the unexpected opportunities that followed, and ultimately the chance to help reshape how an industry valued experience, that was something special. As I approached my 9th decade, I began to think more seriously about retirement, not from the cause that had become my passion, but from the formal roles I had accumulated. I stepped down from my position at Northeast Logistics, transitioning to emeritus status while continuing to chair the industry consortium on age diversity. I scaled back my consulting work, focusing on a handful of clients committed to meaningful change in how they approached intergenerational workforces. 10 years after being fired from Central Freight, I was invited to speak at a retirement celebration for Robert Chen, the Northeast Logistics CEO who had created the opportunity for me to influence the company's culture and, by extension, the industry's approach to valuing experience. When I first approached Marianne about helping with the Central Freight integration, Chen told the assembled guests, "I thought we were getting an experienced consultant who understood the company's history and relationships. What we got instead was a visionary who helped us rethink our entire approach to valuing experience and managing across generations." The programs she implemented have become a competitive advantage for Northeast Logistics and a model for the industry. After the celebration, Chen took me aside. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said. "Whatever happened to the people who fired you, Greg and Tina?" "Right." I smiled at the question. "Greg rebuilt his career, though never at the same level. We occasionally meet for coffee. He's learned a lot about the value of experience, the hard way, but thoroughly. Tina actually became an advocate for age diversity in her subsequent roles. She speaks at some of our consortium events now, using her experience at Central Freight as a cautionary tale." Chen shook his head in amazement. "So, in the end, even the people who tried to push you aside ended up being influenced by your work. That's quite a legacy, Marianne." Legacy. The word resonated with me as I drove home that evening. When I had been escorted from Central Freight with my small box of belongings, legacy was the furthest thing from my mind. I had been focused on survival, emotional and financial, not on the lasting impact I might have on an industry or on the broader conversation about age and work in our society. Yet, here I was, a decade later, looking back on a journey that had taken me from the humiliation of dismissal after 37 years to a position of influence I never could have anticipated. The suppliers who had followed me, causing panic in the president's office, had not only helped me establish my consulting business, but had also demonstrated the tangible value of relationships built over decades. The young schedulers who had cheered my departure had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just my career, but potentially an industry's approach to valuing experience. As I reflected on this unexpected legacy, I thought about the cyclical nature of life and work. Greg and Tina, in their rush to push out the old to make way for the new, had failed to understand a fundamental truth that progress doesn't come from replacement, but from building upon what came before. From combining the energy and fresh perspectives of youth with the wisdom and relationships of experience. That understanding, hard-won through my own journey of being valued, devalued, and ultimately revalued in ways I never could have anticipated, had become my contribution, my legacy to an industry and perhaps to the broader conversation about age and work in our society. Being fired after 37 years had seemed like the end. Instead, it had been a beginning, the start of a journey that had taken me places I never could have imagined. Greg and Tina had meant to sideline me, but in doing so, they had inadvertently set me free. The suppliers who followed me had caused panic in the president's office, but they had also helped me build something new and meaningful. And I, at 59, had found not the end of my career, but its most significant and fulfilling chapter. The wheel turns, I thought as I arrived home. Sometimes it crushes us beneath its weight, and sometimes it carries us forward to unexpected heights. The key is to keep moving, to remain open to the possibilities that emerge from even our most painful experiences, and to remember that what often looks like an ending may, in fact, be just the beginning of something far more meaningful than we could ever have imagined. My name is Marianne Davies, and this is my story. A story that began with being fired after 37 years, continued through the panic of a president when 49 suppliers followed me out the door, and evolved into something I never could have anticipated: a journey of resilience, reinvention, and ultimately, redemption. Not the redemption of being invited back to my old position, but the deeper redemption of discovering that my value extended far beyond any single company or role, that the very experience that had been devalued could become the foundation for something far more significant than I ever could have built had I remained where I was. It's a story that continues to unfold, even now, because the true measure of our careers isn't in the titles we hold or the years we serve, but in the impact we have on others and the legacy we leave behind. And sometimes, as I discovered, that legacy emerges not from our carefully laid plans, but from our response to the unexpected detours and challenges that life inevitably places in our path. Being fired after 37 years was not the end of my story. It was merely the beginning of its most important chapter.